The cops decided to humiliate a little girl right in front of the neighbors, thinking no one would defend her, but they had no idea who her mother was. When Ronda Rousey, the legendary champion, stepped outside, everything changed in an instant. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. The air over the neighborhood shimmered with heat, the kind of dense summer warmth that seemed to slow time itself, stretching the hours into golden ribbons. The sidewalks glowed pale and bright under the sun, their surfaces etched with fading chalk drawings from the previous day. Hopscotch grids, lopsided flowers, and stick-figure families with radiant circles for heads. The cicadas buzzed from the trees, an insistent background chorus to the laughter of children spilling into yards and across front lawns. It was the sort of afternoon that parents remembered from their own childhoods, when freedom meant grass stains on knees and the taste of lemonade so sweet it made your teeth ache. In the middle of it all lay 6-year-old Maddie, sprawled on her belly at the edge of her grandmother's driveway, her elbows white with chalk dust. She clutched a stub of blue chalk with the concentration of an artist, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth as she drew the outline of a wide, lopsided house. Already the cracked cement bore a patchwork mural swirls of color, shaky letters, attempts at trees, and above it all, the careful scrawl of Maddie's vision. A house with a garden, smoke curling from its chimney, and 2 figures holding hands. One was tall, with an exaggerated halo of hair. The other, smaller, with braids cascading down her shoulders. Maddie paused to add a picnic blanket beneath them, tiny circles for sandwiches, a blob of red that was supposed to be watermelon. From the porch, her grandmother sat in her rocking chair, fanning herself with a folded newspaper, the chair creaking a steady rhythm in time with the day. She wore a cotton blouse faded from years of washing, its pattern nearly rubbed away by time, but her eyes were alert, sharp, protective. Her gaze rarely strayed far from the little girl on the concrete. Maddie would look up now and then, waving her chalk triumphantly to share some new addition, and each time her grandmother smiled, nodding approval as if the drawings carried the weight of masterpieces. Across the street, the Martinez children had turned their yard into a water park. A garden hose arced rainbow droplets across the grass as the kids squealed, darting in and out of the spray, their clothes clinging damp and cool to their skin. 8-year-old Deja held the hose like a sword, pointing it at her younger brother Marcus, who screamed and giggled as the water splashed his chest. Their shrieks carried down the block, blending with the distant bark of a dog, the whir of a passing lawnmower, and the rustle of leaves stirred by a lazy breeze. The smell of grilled meat drifted faintly from a backyard further down, mingling with the sharp scent of wet pavement. Maddie sat back on her heels, dusting her hands together. A streak of chalk smeared across her cheek, but she paid it no mind. She gazed at her drawing proudly, then sprang up and ran barefoot across the warm concrete toward the edge of the yard. "Grandma, look!" she shouted, pointing down at her masterpiece. "That's us, see? That's you and me having a picnic." Her grandmother rose from the rocking chair slowly, stiff joints reminding her of their years, and leaned on the porch railing to peer down. The heat pressed close, sweat glistening at her temples, but her eyes softened at the sight. "It's beautiful, baby," she said warmly. The words carried not just approval, but the quiet reverence of someone who cherished small joys. Maddie grinned, satisfied, then scampered toward the Martinez yard where the hose still hissed. The other children welcomed her with shouts, handing her a dripping sponge to join in their games. Within seconds, her sundress was spattered, her braids damp as she leapt through the spray with abandon. The children's laughter rang out like bells, a pure sound that belonged to summer. Neighbors watched from porches, some sipping cold drinks, some chatting idly, but all lulled into the comfort of the season. It was a neighborhood that, on afternoons like this, felt safe, woven together by routine and familiarity. The children knew every crack in the sidewalks, every tree that could be climbed, every shortcut between yards. For them, the world stretched no further than the end of the block, and it was a world filled with color and play. Yet beneath the surface calm, attention waited, silent but undeniable, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Adults in the neighborhood felt it, though they didn't speak of it often, the weight of watchful eyes, the hum of authority that lingered too close. Some chose not to think about it, retreating into their routines. But it was there all the same. The children, innocent and trusting, were unaware. They saw only sprinklers and chalk and the freedom of endless afternoons. Maddie shrieked as Marcus sprayed her with the hose, the icy water sending goosebumps across her arms. She retaliated by stomping into a puddle, splashing him back, both of them dissolving into laughter. Deja clapped her hands and shouted encouragement, her voice high and bright. The sound carried down the street, where a pair of tires crunched slowly over asphalt. The noise was faint at first, nearly lost beneath the shouts of the children, but Grandma's ears caught it. She turned her head toward the corner of the block, squinting through the glare of sunlight. A white cruiser rolled into view, its paint glinting sharply, the black letters on its side stark against the brightness. The vehicle crept forward with deliberate slowness, as if the heat weighed it down, until it pulled to a stop near the curb across from the Martinez house. The engine idled, a low growl that seemed to still the air. The children, caught in their game, did not notice at first. Maddie raised her arms to feel the spray of water, her face turned upward, eyes closed in delight. Marcus squealed as Deja shouted, "Your turn!" The sound of joy echoed against the quiet hum of the cruiser. On the porch, Grandma's rocker creaked to a stop. She placed the newspaper down on her lap, her knuckles whitening slightly against its folded edge. She did not move, but her eyes remained fixed on the car as the doors opened and two officers stepped out. Their boots struck the pavement with sharp thuds, their shadows stretching long across the sidewalk. In that instant, the golden rhythm of the afternoon faltered. The laughter of the children still filled the air, but beneath it ran a current of unease, subtle yet unmistakable, like the first cold breath of wind before a storm. Maddie splashed in another puddle, still oblivious, while her grandmother's gaze lingered, unblinking, on the figures now approaching the yard. The world of chalk and water and laughter was about to change. The cruiser's presence lingered like a shadow over the cheerful noise of the street, its engine ticking as it cooled beneath the relentless summer sun. The two officers who stepped out seemed to carry the heat with them, heavy and oppressive, each movement deliberate as if designed to draw every eye in the neighborhood. Their uniforms, crisp and sharp, reflected authority not through dignity, but through intimidation. And the rhythm of children's laughter faltered as the weight of their approach settled over the yard. Marcus, the little boy still clutching the garden hose, froze mid-spray. The arc of water fell uselessly to the grass at his feet, soaking his sneakers and darkening the patch of earth beneath him. His eyes widened as the officers closed the distance, boots scraping against the pavement in a cadence too sharp, too harsh for a summer afternoon. Deja's giggle died on her lips as she noticed the way their gazes swept over the yard, not with curiosity or casual watchfulness, but with the precision of men searching for a target. Maddie, still damp from her leap through the spray, turned in time to see one of the officers concade, tall and broad, his jaw tight as if clenched around some unspoken anger, raise a hand in a gesture that silenced the neighborhood as surely as if he had struck a gong. "Hey!" His voice boomed across the yard, rough and commanding, echoing against the walls of the Martinez home. Every child stiffened at once. Even the cicadas seemed to pause, the stillness that followed his shout thick enough to choke on. The second officer, Mays, stepped forward with a smirk curling her lips, her hands planted on her hips in a pose that might have been casual if not for the cold calculation in her eyes. She looked from Marcus to Deja, then to Maddie, who was still standing defiantly near the edge of the yard, braids clinging damply to her cheeks. Mays's gaze lingered on her, measuring, appraising, as though she had already found the one to single out. "That's city water you're wasting," Mays said, her tone mocking, each word drawn out as though speaking to fools. "Real reckless there, aren't you, boy?" Her eyes snapped back to Marcus, and he shrank beneath the weight of her attention, the hose trembling in his small hands until the water spluttered weakly against the grass. From her porch, Grandma's chair had gone still. The fan of her newspaper lay forgotten at her side as she leaned forward, her lips pressed tightly together. Her heart quickened, but her voice did not rise. She knew the danger of rushing in too quickly, knew the importance of waiting, of watching. Yet every muscle in her body screamed to step between those officers and the children who had become their quarry. Kincaid strode closer, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward the puddles spreading across the sidewalk and grass. Look at this mess. This is exactly the kind of behavior we're tired of seeing in this neighborhood. No respect for property, no discipline. Chaos. His voice was laced with contempt, the kind that dripped slow and poisonous, the kind that wasn't about water at all but about power. The children's faces reflected a range of emotions, fear, confusion, shame, though none of them truly understood what crime they were supposed to have committed. Deja clutched Marcus's arm, tugging him back, whispering for him to put the hose down, as if that simple act might undo the moment. Maddie's chalk-stained fists clenched at her sides, her small chest rising and falling as she struggled to contain the fire that sparked in her. Grandma called softly from the porch, her voice low, urging caution, but Maddie was already moving. She stepped forward, sandals slapping wet against the pavement, until she stood between Marcus and the looming figure of Officer Kincaid. Her chin tilted upward, her eyes fierce despite the tremor that ran through her body. She was 6 years old, but in that instant she carried herself with the stubbornness of someone far older. Someone who had been raised to know that silence in the face of cruelty was no virtue. "He's not bad," Maddie declared, her voice small but steady, carrying across the yard with surprising clarity. "He's just playing." The children behind her held their breath. Marcus's lip quivered, his fingers slipping from the hose as though her words alone had lifted the weight of blame from him. Deja's eyes widened in awe at Maddie's defiance. Kincaid's head snapped toward her. His eyes, already hard, darkened further, as if her audacity had struck him like a slap. He stepped closer, towering over her, his shadow blotting out the sun at her feet. "Excuse me?" His tone was dangerously quiet now, the low rumble of a storm about to break. Maddie's knees shook, but she did not step back. Instead, she planted her bare feet firmly on the wet concrete, the way she had seen her mother do countless times when making a point that could not be denied. "You're the bullies," she said, her voice louder this time, echoing words she had heard at home, words that carried the unmistakable ring of truth. Behind him, Maze let out a laugh that scraped against the air, sharp and cruel. "Listen to this one, Brent," she sneered, nudging her partner. "Thinks she can lecture us about respect, from the mouth of a baby." Her eyes glittered with amusement, but it was the kind that found joy only in cruelty. The other children, emboldened by Maddie's stand yet still terrified, crept closer behind her, their wide eyes locked on her small form, as though she were their shield. Marcus still held the hose, but its stream had dwindled to nothing, the water pooling uselessly at his feet. "I said show some respect," Kincaid growled, his hand drifting meaningfully toward his belt. The leather creaked under his fingers, and the children's breath caught as though they expected the earth itself to crack open. Maddie's response came not from thought, but from the raw instinct of a child unwilling to be cowed. She stuck out her tongue, a childish gesture that carried with it all the defiance in the world, and stomped her foot hard into a puddle. Water splashed up in an arc, spraying across Kincaid's polished shoes, leaving dark blotches that crept up his pant cuffs. For one suspended moment, the yard was utterly still. Then laughter erupted from the children, hesitant at first, nervous and shaky, but growing as the image of the towering officer with wet shoes sank in. Giggles became snorts, snorts became shrieks of laughter, and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of their triumph, small and fragile, but undeniable. Kincaid's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening as he glanced down at his ruined shoes, then back up at Maddie's unflinching face. The veins at his temple pulsed as his fingers twitched near his belt, his control slipping with every sound of laughter that rippled from the children. His embarrassment was raw, naked, and it spread across his features with the speed of fire. Grandma's rocker creaked as she rose, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm, making her way down the porch steps as quickly as her body would allow. The children's laughter faltered when they saw the fury in Kincaid's eyes, the dangerous way his body leaned forward. The storm was no longer just looming, it was ready to break. Maze's gaze darted to the curb, where the Martinez family's car washing supplies sat neatly piled, sponges, rags, and a large blue bucket still half full of water. Her lips curled into a slow, cruel smile, and she nudged Kincaid with her elbow. "You know what they say about disrespectful children," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Sometimes they need a good cooling off." Her steps toward the bucket were deliberate, her smirk widening with each one. The other children began to back away, their bravery dissolving as they sensed the danger shifting, escalating. Marcus dropped the hose altogether, retreating behind Deja, his eyes wide with dread. "Don't you dare!" Grandma's voice cut through the air, trembling with anger as she stumbled across the yard. But her age and aching joints slowed her, her warning arriving too late. Maze gripped the bucket, water sloshing against its sides, and advanced on Maddie, her shadow long and sharp under the sinking sun. Maddie's eyes widened, her body frozen as she realized what was about to happen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. With a sharp twist of her wrist, Maze upended the bucket. The icy water cascaded down over Maddie's head, drenching her from braids to sandals. Her small body shuddered violently from the shock, her pink sundress clinging to her like a second skin. Water streamed down her cheeks in rivulets, dripping from her lashes, her lips parted in a gasp that caught in her throat. Gasps and cries rose from porches and sidewalks as neighbors bore witness, horror etched on every face. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her chest. Mr. Jenkins's newspaper fell forgotten to the ground. The laughter of moments before had evaporated, leaving only the sound of Maddie's ragged breathing and the trickle of water dripping from her tiny frame into the growing puddle at her feet. The second chapter closed around that image. A child soaked and trembling, a neighborhood stunned into silence, and two officers standing triumphant in their cruelty. The fragile innocence of a summer afternoon had been shattered, and the shadow cast over Harbor Heights deepened, heavy with the weight of what was still to come. For a long moment after the water splashed down, time seemed to stretch and crackle. Every heartbeat magnified into something unbearable. The children stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths half open but silent, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Maddie did not move. The icy water clung to her like a second skin, her sundress heavy and plastered against her tiny body, her braids dripping onto her cheeks. The cold was shocking, but the sting of humiliation was far sharper, burning through her chest as the officer's laughter broke the stunned silence. The sound was cruel, jagged, carrying no joy, only dominance. Kincaid's laughter was low and grating, while Maze's rang shrill, like glass shattering on stone. They looked down at Maddie not as a child, but as an object they had proven could be broken. Maddie's small fists clenched at her sides, trembling as she fought to hold back tears. She wanted to cry, wanted to run into her grandmother's arms, but something inside her, something that belonged to her mother, refused to let her crumble before them. Around her, the other children shifted uneasily. Marcus took a hesitant step forward, his lips quivering as if he wanted to speak, but Deja pulled him back quickly, shaking her head, her eyes full of terror. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Adults leaned forward on porches, their faces pale and drawn, torn between outrage and fear. Everyone knew too well the danger of raising their voices against the uniform. They had seen it before. Men thrown against cars, women dragged by wrists, accusations twisted into weapons. Now they saw it aimed at a little girl, and still they hesitated, their silence heavy as stone. Grandma finally reached the edge of the yard, her breath ragged, her hands trembling not from age alone, but from fury so deep it seemed to shake her to her core. "That's enough," she rasped, her voice breaking through the stillness. She reached for Maddie, but Kincaid stepped forward, blocking her path with a hand raised in warning. His smirk was gone, replaced with the stern mask of authority, as though his cruelty had been a lesson in order rather than an act of sadism. "Control your child," he said flatly, his tone daring her to defy him. "Or we will." The words sank into the air like poison, chilling every ear that heard them. Grandma's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, her fury colliding with the knowledge of how dangerous this had become. She wanted to gather Maddie into her arms, to shield her, to scream at these men who thought terrorizing a child was their right. But her body felt fragile, and she knew a single misstep could turn this into something worse. Still, her eyes blazed as she met his, refusing to cower. Maddie shivered, droplets streaming from her chin to the pavement below, but she did not cry. Instead, she looked up at Kincaid with a gaze too steady for a 6-year-old, her chest rising and falling as though she were holding in a storm. Inside, shame and fear wrestled with something brighter, fiercer, a stubborn pride that refused to give him the satisfaction of her collapse. She would not give him her tears, though they burned at the back of her throat. The other children began to murmur, whispers rippling like restless leaves. They had seen bullies in the schoolyard, older kids who pushed and teased. But this was different. These were grown-ups, officers, people they had been told to respect and obey. If they could do this to Maddie, what hope did any of them have? Their faith in safety cracked, replaced by a fear that would linger long after the water dried. Maze set the bucket down with deliberate slowness, the sound of plastic against pavement loud in the silence. She crouched slightly, tilting her head as she regarded Maddie, her expression one of mock pity. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked in a voice sugar-coated but dripping with venom. "Cat got your tongue? Not so brave now, are you?" Maddie's lips pressed together tightly, refusing to answer. Her silence was its own form of defiance, but Maze only smiled, satisfied at the sight of her trembling. She straightened, brushing her hands together as though she had accomplished something worthwhile. Kincaid turned his gaze to the circle of neighbors who had gathered at their porches, his expression daring any of them to object. "You all saw it," he said coldly. "We warned them. Kids running wild, no discipline. This is what happens when parents don't do their jobs." His words carried the weight of official judgment, twisting the cruelty into a performance of authority, and the neighbors lowered their eyes, their anger forced into silence. Grandma's hand hovered just above Maddie's shoulder before finally resting there, a gentle weight of comfort. The child leaned into it instinctively, her body shaking, but still she kept her chin up, refusing to let her shoulders slump. For all her size and age, she was still standing. That was something. The officers, bored now that their point had been made, exchanged a glance and a small nod. Their laughter had faded, replaced by the smug satisfaction of predators, certain they had secured their dominance. "Let's go," Maze muttered, turning toward the cruiser. Kincaid lingered for a moment longer, eyes hard on Maddie, before he followed, boots striking sharp against the pavement. The engine roared to life, and the cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its shadow stretching long across the cracked asphalt. Only when it disappeared around the corner did the air seem to loosen, as though the neighborhood had been holding its breath the entire time. Children rushed toward Maddie at once, their voices a chorus of shock and sympathy. Deja reached for her hand. Marcus wrapped his arms around her waist, their small gestures meant to offer the comfort adults had been too afraid to provide. Maddie let them cling to her, but her eyes stayed fixed on the place where the cruiser had vanished, her mind replaying the officer's laughter again and again until it echoed louder than the cicadas. Grandma crouched carefully, her knees protesting, and wiped at Maddie's face with the corner of her sleeve. The water had begun to dry in streaks, leaving her skin sticky with salt and her hair tangled against her cheeks. "Baby," Grandma whispered, her voice thick with grief. "I'm so sorry." Maddie finally blinked, her lashes heavy, but she still refused to cry. Her small voice, hoarse from holding back, escaped in a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong." "No," Grandma said firmly, pressing a trembling kiss to her forehead. "You didn't." But even as she spoke the truth, she knew it would not erase the sting. The humiliation had been public, deliberate, meant to etch itself into memory, and it had. Maddie would not forget the feeling of icy water, the weight of ridicule, the towering figures who laughed at her pain. The blow had been struck not only against her body, but against her innocence, and though she had stood as tall as she could, something had cracked in the quiet corners of her heart. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yards, and the cicadas resumed their endless song as though nothing had happened. But the neighborhood knew better. Every adult who had watched would carry the guilt of silence. Every child who had seen would carry the lesson of fear, and Maddie herself would carry the memory like a scar. The storm had broken, and though the air felt stifling still, it was only the beginning. Maddie's shiver subsided, replaced by a steadiness that seemed too old for her 6 years. Her grandmother wrapped her arms around her, and for a brief moment, Maddie allowed herself to rest there, safe and small. But in the distance, fate was already moving, drawing closer on footsteps Maddie knew by heart. The moment of reckoning had not yet come, but it was on its way, carried with the promise of a mother's return. The neighborhood still trembled with the echo of what had happened, the laughter of the officers lingering in the humid air long after their cruiser had disappeared around the corner. The children clung together, whispers rising like smoke, while the adults stood rooted in shame and silence. Maddie, soaked and shivering, leaned against her grandmother's side, her small frame stiff as though refusing the comfort of being held too tightly. The water that had drenched her was already beginning to dry beneath the sun, but the humiliation clung heavier than the damp fabric of her sundress. She looked older somehow in that moment, though her braids still dripped against her cheeks, and her fists remained clenched at her sides. It was in that silence, fragile and weighted, that the sound of approaching footsteps broke the stillness. They were steady, unhurried, almost deceptively calm, but each one seemed to ripple through the neighborhood like a drumbeat. Heads turned as a familiar figure came into view at the far end of the block. The sight of her drew murmurs, relief blooming faintly in the hearts of those who had watched in powerless anguish. For they knew who she was, even if the officers had not cared to know. Ronda Rousey walked with the ease of someone who carried storms within her, but refused to unleash them without purpose. Her frame, powerful and unmistakably athletic, moved with a grace that belied the strength coiled beneath the surface. The sun caught on her hair, pulled back tightly as though even it knew better than to fall wild into her eyes. She had returned from errands, unaware at first of the scene she was stepping into, until her gaze locked on her daughter. Maddie stood alone now, a few steps apart from the cluster of children, her small chin lifted, though her body trembled. Her grandmother's hand rested protectively on her shoulder, but Maddie's eyes sought out her mother's, instantly wide and shining with everything she had held back until that moment. Rhonda's pace slowed as her heart clenched at the sight, the image etching itself into her memory like a scar. Her baby, drenched and trembling, a circle of stunned witnesses around her. She crossed the last few yards quickly then, kneeling before Maddie without a word. Her hands, strong and sure, cupped the child's face gently, brushing wet strands of hair away. She scanned her daughter with a precision born from both maternal instinct and the trained eye of a fighter, searching for injuries, for the smallest sign of harm. Maddie tried to speak, but her throat caught, and instead she pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, the dam of her defiance cracking at last. Tears spilled freely, hot and furious, as though she could no longer hold them back now that her safe place had returned. Rhonda held her close, her jaw tightening, her body taut with restrained rage. She rocked her gently, whispering words only Maddie could hear, though her eyes burned as they lifted to meet her mother's. Grandma shook her head slightly, the gesture filled with both apology and anguish. She had tried, but she could not shield Maddie from what had been done. Rhonda's nod was subtle, her face composed, but beneath it ran a current of fury that threatened to shatter the composure she fought to maintain. The murmurs of the neighbors grew louder now, stories already spilling, their outrage cautious but swelling. Some spoke of the officers' laughter, others of the bucket overturned. Each retelling sharpened the edges of the humiliations until it cut like glass. Rhonda listened, each word feeding the storm inside her, though her expression remained carved from stone. She did not explode, did not shout. Her silence was colder, sharper, the silence of someone who would not waste her fury on words when action was inevitable. The children huddled closer together, watching her with wide eyes, sensing the shift in the air. They had seen authority weaponized in cruelty, but now they witnessed something entirely different. Authority grounded in love, in justice, in a strength not of intimidation, but of truth. Even the adults felt it, the tension easing slightly in their shoulders as they realized the balance of power had shifted. With Rhonda here, the cruelty they had endured would not stand unchallenged. Maddie pulled back at last, her small hands gripping her mother's arms as though anchoring herself. Her voice was hoarse, broken by tears. "They poured it on me, Mama." The words, simple and raw, struck like a hammer blow. Rhonda closed her eyes briefly, pressing her lips to Maddie's forehead before standing. She rose slowly, deliberately, her full height casting a long shadow across the driveway. She did not need to speak yet. The neighbors could already feel the intent radiating from her. She turned her gaze toward the street where the cruiser had vanished, as if she could summon it back through sheer force of will. And then, as though fate itself had bent to her will, the sound of the engine returned. The cruiser rolled back into view at the far end of the block, its tires crunching on the asphalt, its presence once again choking the air. Kincaid and Mays had not gone far after all. Perhaps they had decided their lesson wasn't finished, or perhaps their pride demanded more spectacle. Whatever the reason, their return was poorly timed. For now Ronda stood waiting. The car pulled up with a growl, and the two officers stepped out again, their faces smug, unaware of what awaited them. They approached with the same arrogance as before, laughter already curling on Mays's lips. But it faltered when she saw the woman standing tall, her arms crossed loosely, her daughter sheltered behind her. Kincaid's eyes narrowed, his stride slowing, as though something in Ronda's gaze unsettled him. She said nothing at first, simply letting them close the distance until they stood only a few feet away. The tension in the air was palpable, every neighbor leaning forward, every child clutching at one another as if afraid to breathe. Maddie pressed close to her grandmother, her small face peeking out, watching as her mother faced the people who had humiliated her. When Ronda finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, controlled. There was no shouting, no anger spilling uncontrolled, but the weight of her words struck heavier than any scream. "That's my daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cicadas seemed to fall quiet, the summer air stilled by the gravity of her presence. The officers shifted uneasily, though they tried to mask it with smirks and bravado. But the tide had turned. The balance of power no longer belonged to them. The neighborhood sensed it too. Shoulders straightened, whispers swelled into murmurs of encouragement, and the children's eyes lit with a flicker of hope. Something irreversible had begun. Ronda Rousey had returned, and with her came the promise that the cruelty dealt in her absence would not remain unanswered. The silence that followed Ronda's words seemed to stretch across the entire neighborhood, heavy and unbroken. The two officers had not expected resistance, least of all from someone who stood so calmly before them. Neighbors pressed closer to their porches, their breaths held, sensing that something far greater than a simple dispute was unfolding. Children clutched one another's hands, their wide eyes darting between the men in uniform and the woman who stood like an immovable force, her daughter sheltered behind her. Ronda's presence unsettled them in ways they could not fully name. Kincaid tried to hide his unease behind a smirk, shifting his weight as though reminding himself of the badge that hung at his chest. Mays's lips curled into a cruel grin, but it faltered when her eyes lingered on Ronda's posture, the way her shoulders squared, her stance balanced, her gaze unwavering. This was not a parent about to beg or plead. This was someone carved from steel, radiating a certainty that their power, so casually wielded moments ago, had already begun to crumble. Maddie pressed her face against her grandmother's hip, still trembling, but her eyes peeked out, watching every detail. For her, this was more than protection, it was revelation. She had never seen her mother in this light, a force not only of love, but of unshakable authority. It was not loud, not boastful. It was the quiet strength of someone who knew her own power so completely that she need not raise her voice to be heard. Kincaid stepped forward, his boots scraping the asphalt, and forced out a laugh that rang hollow in the tense air. "Looks like we've got ourselves an angry parent. Maybe you should teach your kid some manners instead of letting her mouth off to officers of the law." The words were meant to sting, but they bounced off Ronda like pebbles against armor. She didn't even blink. Her silence was heavier than any retort. Mays, emboldened by her partner's attempt, lifted her chin. "That's right. If kids around here showed a little more respect, maybe they wouldn't find themselves needing lessons." Her eyes flicked toward Maddie as she spoke, and the cruelty of the insinuation was enough to send a wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd. It was then that Ronda moved, not forward in aggression, but a single step sideways, positioning herself more fully between the officers and her daughter. The shift was subtle, almost graceful, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a shield locking into place. Her arms remained at her sides, relaxed, but every line of her body radiated readiness. Those trained in violence knew it when they saw it, and though Kincaid and Mays would never admit it, something primal in them recognized the warning. "You humiliated a child," Ronda said finally, her voice low, steady, each word deliberate. "My child." She did not shout, but her words struck like hammer blows. "And you laughed while you did it." Kincaid's jaw tightened, his pride pricked. His hand drifted near his belt, hovering close to the weapon holstered there, though he had no reason to draw it. The gesture was not lost on Ronda. She saw the twitch, the subtle flex of his fingers, the shallow breath that betrayed his nervousness. In another life, another world, she might have ignored it, but not now, not here, not when her daughter still shivered behind her. Mays stepped closer, the empty bucket from earlier still resting carelessly in her hand, as if it were a prop in some twisted performance. "You think your kid's special? Think she doesn't need to learn the same lessons as the rest of them?" She sneered. "We'll teach respect to anyone who—" She never finished. Ronda's eyes, sharp as steel, cut her words in half. "You've mistaken cruelty for authority," she said, "and intimidation for respect. What you've taught today isn't respect. It's fear, but fear doesn't last." The crowd shifted, emboldened by her words. Neighbors who had shrunk back began to step forward, their anger no longer hidden but simmering in their eyes. Mothers folded their arms across their chests, fathers clenched their jaws, and even the children straightened, sensing the tide turn. The officers felt it too, the weight of a community no longer cowed but galvanized. Kincaid's temper flared, his voice sharp. "You better watch yourself, lady. Interfering with police business carries consequences." His words rang louder than intended, an edge of desperation bleeding through. He was losing control, and he knew it. Ronda's expression did not change. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "You've already made your mistake," she said softly, "and now you'll answer for it." The tension snapped like a taut rope breaking. Kincaid lunged forward, his pride goading him into recklessness. His hands shot out, not for his weapon, but to shove, to intimidate, to reassert the dominance slipping through his fingers. But Ronda was no bystander. She had trained her entire life for moments like this, not in streets or playgrounds, but in arenas where seconds mattered and reflex was everything. Her body moved with a precision honed by years of combat. She stepped into his advance rather than away from it, her hand catching his wrist in midair, twisting with such fluidity that his own momentum carried him off balance. Before he realized what had happened, he was bent forward, his face inches from the ground, his arm locked painfully behind his back. Ronda's other hand pressed lightly against the back of his neck, not crushing, not brutal, but firm enough to remind him how easily she could end this. Gas erupted from the onlookers. Children's eyes widened in awe. Neighbors covered their mouths, stunned at the suddenness of it. Ronda hadn't attacked. She had simply redirected, turned his arrogance against him with a skill so effortless it seemed like choreography. Mays froze, her cruel grin erased in an instant. Her hand tightened around the bucket, but her eyes darted nervously between Ronda and Kincaid, who groaned under the pressure of the hold. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. "Release him," Mays demanded, though her voice lacked conviction. "You'll regret this." Ronda looked up, her eyes locking on Mays. "No," she replied evenly. "The only ones with regrets today are you." She let Kincaid up with a calculated motion, shoving him backward just enough to send him stumbling, his pride wounded more deeply than his body. He staggered upright, face flushed, breathing hard. His hands twitched, uncertain, but he did not lunge again. The crowd, emboldened now, erupted into shouts, not of fear, but of support. Neighbors called out words of encouragement, children clapped, and the tide had fully turned. These officers were no longer feared. They were exposed. Mays's voice wavered, her earlier cruelty gone. "This isn't over," she spat, though the tremor in her tone betrayed her. "You'll pay for this." Ronda stepped forward, her body loose and ready, her stance grounded as though the earth itself steadied her. "I already have," she said softly. Every parent pays when bullies are allowed to roam free. But it ends today. The officers faltered, their confidence stripped bare. They exchanged a look, then retreated slowly toward their cruiser, their threats ringing hollow in the air. The crowd parted, not with fear, but with defiance, their eyes following the disgraced figures who had once ruled the block with intimidation. When the car door slammed and the cruiser pulled away, a cheer rose from the neighbors. It was not the wild cheer of victory, but the fierce, raw cheer of people reclaiming something that had been stolen from them. Maddie ran into her mother's arms, her sobs replaced with laughter tinged by awe. Ronda lifted her, holding her close, the storm inside her settling into something steadier, something stronger. She kissed her daughter's damp hair, whispering, "You're safe now." But in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. The clash was not just between her and two officers. It was with a system that allowed cruelty to masquerade as law. And though the immediate battle had been won, the war for dignity, respect, and justice was only beginning. The neighborhood knew it too. Their cheers faded into solemn vows whispered among families, promises that they would not remain silent again. And as the summer sun dipped lower, painting the street in long shadows, Ronda Rousey stood at the center of it all, her daughter in her arms, her resolve unshaken. She had faced their cruelty, broken their arrogance, and shown everyone watching that true strength was not in domination, but in protection. And though the officers had retreated, the story of what had happened that day was only beginning to spread. It would not be silenced. The echoes of the crowd's defiance still lingered long after the police cruiser had vanished into the distance. The neighborhood, once subdued by fear, now buzzed with a strange mixture of awe, disbelief, and a fragile but undeniable hope. Neighbors stood in clusters, their voices hushed at first, then swelling with the courage that came from having witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen the balance of power shift in front of their eyes, not through weapons or intimidation, but through the sheer will and unyielding strength of one mother standing against injustice. Children darted about once more, their play hesitant at first, as though testing the safety of their reclaimed space. But laughter, pure and unbroken, soon began to echo again, timid giggles growing into confident peals of joy. Maddie, still damp but now wrapped in a dry towel someone had brought from their house, nestled in her mother's arms. She was quiet, her small face pressed close against Ronda's shoulder, but her eyes no longer held the same fear. They were wide with something new, something stronger faith. Ronda felt it too, though beneath her calm exterior raged a storm that would not easily settle. What she had done in those minutes would spread far beyond this block, of that she was certain. The humiliation those officers had inflicted on her child had been public, cruel, calculated to diminish. But what they had not counted on was that their cruelty would spark resistance that could not be drowned by a bucket of water. It would ripple outward, carried on every voice that retold the story, gaining strength with each retelling until it became impossible to silence. Grandma stood nearby, her hand pressed against her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. She had seen too many moments like this before, too many nights of watching families buckle under the weight of authority, twisted into arrogance. But this was different. This time the wrong had been met with immediate reckoning. This time justice had stood in the form of a daughter defending her own child, and the image would never leave her. The neighbors approached one by one, offering their words of support, their gratitude, their willingness to testify to what they had witnessed. Phones had recorded, eyes had seen, voices had carried every detail. This would not disappear into rumor. The truth had been laid bare, and the community would not allow it to be erased. For every attempt to twist the story into lies, there would be 10 voices shouting what really happened. As the sun began to dip lower, casting the street in golden light, Ronda walked Maddie and her grandmother back to the house. The porch, with its rocking chair and flower pots, looked unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. It felt reclaimed, no longer a place of quiet endurance, but of strength and resilience. Inside, Ronda settled Maddie onto the couch, wrapping her in a soft blanket and smoothing damp strands of hair from her forehead. Maddie looked up, her small voice trembling but clear. "You came back, Mama." Rhonda bent down, kissing her cheek softly. "I always will," she whispered. The words carried more than comfort. They carried a promise etched deeper than any wound. That night, as the house grew quiet and Maddie finally drifted into sleep, Rhonda sat with her mother, the weight of the day pressing down. They both knew this was not the end. The officers would not surrender their arrogance so easily. There would be reports twisted into lies, citations designed to punish the innocent, threats whispered into phones to intimidate witnesses. The system would resist, as it always had. But for the first time, Rhonda felt not just anger, but clarity. This was no longer only about her daughter. It was about every child humiliated, every family broken, every moment of fear forced upon those who deserved peace. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as though she could see beyond it, into the future that awaited. "They'll come for us," her mother said quietly, her voice tinged with worry. "They already have," Rhonda replied softly, "but now we're ready." The days that followed proved her right. Word of the incident spread quickly, first through the neighborhood, then the city, until reporters appeared on corners and microphones were shoved toward those willing to speak. Neighbors, once too frightened to lift their voices, spoke with fire in their throats, recounting not only what had happened to Maddie, but years of harassment and cruelty. The image of a small girl drenched in water by officers meant to protect her seared itself into the city's conscience. No official report could erase it. No carefully drafted statement could soften its edges. The police attempted to retaliate with citations and claims of misconduct, but each attempt fell apart under the weight of witnesses and recordings. What was once a tactic of intimidation became evidence of corruption. Investigations were launched, lawyers prepared cases, and names long whispered in anger began appearing in official complaints. The system that had protected itself for decades began to crack. For Maddie, the world felt different now. She still carried the memory of cold water cascading over her head, the mocking laughter ringing in her ears. But when she remembered, she also saw the image of her mother standing tall, unshaken, stronger than anyone else in that moment. At school, when children whispered about the incident, some cruel, others curious, she no longer shrank. Instead, she lifted her chin, remembering that she had not stood alone. Her mother had turned humiliation into a spark of change, and she was part of that story. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. Children played freely in the sprinklers again, their laughter louder, defiant in its joy. Parents lingered outside longer, no longer casting nervous glances at every patrol car. They spoke openly now, not just about what had happened, but about the years of quiet suffering they had endured. The silence had been broken, and it could not be restored. The city responded too. Oversight boards were called, hearings were scheduled, and for once the voices of those long ignored echoed in chambers of power. Change was slow, halting, resisted at every step, but it had begun. And at its center was the image of a small child and her mother, a story that had traveled farther than either of them could have imagined. Rhonda knew the fight was not over. She knew that true reform would take more than one incident, more than one neighborhood, more than one confrontation. But she also knew that courage, once awakened, was contagious. She saw it in her neighbor's eyes, in the way children now looked at her daughter with admiration instead of pity, in the way her mother's rocker creaked with pride rather than weary resignation. One evening, weeks after the incident, Rhonda sat with Maddie on the porch as the sun set behind the rooftops. Maddie had chalk spread around her again, her little hands smudged with color as she drew on the walkway. Rhonda watched silently until her daughter stood, beaming with pride, to reveal her creation. On the concrete stretched a picture of their house, the front yard, the sprinklers spraying arcs of water, and in the middle, hand in hand, stood Maddie and her mother, tall and unbroken. Above them, in large, uneven letters, Maddie had scrawled one word: dignity. Rhonda's chest tightened, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She crouched down, wrapping an arm around her daughter and pressing her forehead against hers. "That's exactly right," she whispered. The story would be told and retold, not just as a tale of cruelty, but as a testament to resilience. It would remind those who heard it that humiliation could be answered with courage, that cruelty could be broken by love, that even in the smallest voices lay the power to ignite change. And though the battles ahead were many, the resolution of this one left a mark too deep to be erased. In that quiet neighborhood, on that porch warmed by the fading sun, a mother and her daughter sat together, their shadows stretching across the chalk, drawing like a promise. The future remained uncertain, but their dignity had been reclaimed, and from that dignity would rise the strength to face whatever came next. Don't let this be the last story you see. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss what happens next. Check out the other shocking stories waiting for you on our channel and share this video with your friends, because once they see it, they won't believe it either.